Hopefully everyone can see my screen relatively well. Hopefully a slide. Awesome. So I want to, as we talked about the second half of the day here, it's going to be a lot of thought leadership on open source program offices, along with, just seeing how different open source foundations operate, especially as the Academy Software Foundation is getting to that point where it's at that 3-year mark, and it's a great place to be at a foundation. Learning some of the successes, some of the things that to consider, things that the project might want to think about going forward. And I think all things that all of us, even to take back inside of our member organizations, can potentially benefit from as well. So we want to kick off here with a fireside chat focused on open source program offices. And we're fortunate here to be with two folks who have done a ton of work in this space. I want to start off by first introducing Nigel Simpson. He's an open source and product strategy consultant and previously founded and led Disney's open source program. Nigel, I don't know if I think you're on the line. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself and say a few words.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I got the open source bug at Sun Microsystems. I was working on research projects and started working in the outside world with open source. And when I came to Disney, I kind of discovered that Disney didn't have that culture, and so worked to change the culture there to support open source and establish Disney's open source program office. I'm now working in the capacity of a consultant, sort of come full circle, actually, working with startups that are building building products in the open source space. So it's an exciting time to be in that area, and glad to be here to be participating in this panel.
Absolutely, we're thrilled to have you. And we also have Shilla Saebi. So she's a member of the Comcast open source office. She's an open source program manager, and Comcast is probably one of the great examples of open source program offices that we see. Shilla, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Shilla Saebi, and I'm based right out of Washington, D.C. in a city called Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm an open source program manager at Comcast with a focus on community and developer relations. And I've been with the company for a little over a decade. Prior to this role, I worked in operations engineering for our private cloud team, and I'm passionate about building communities internally through InnerSource and helping grow open source communities for projects that we release. I'm also an open source contributor and maintainer, and I am a Cloud Native Computing Foundation ambassador.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us as well. Introduce yourself. My name is John Mertic. I'm one of the program directors here at the Linux Foundation. So I want to start off because the concept, and you're going to hear the term, we're going to say OSPO all the time here in this conversation, and that stands for Open Source Program Office. And for many of you, this may be a new term. So I want to sort of toss us off, and Shilla, I want to toss it to you first. What is an open source program office, or as it's called here, OSPO?
Sure. So our open source program office, we are a team that consists of roughly 6 people total. And we're a center of excellence for our organization's open source strategy, operations, and all things related to open source. We support roughly 9,000 technologists within our organization. Our OSPO works on educating our community with our open source strategy internally and outside the company too. We organize events like hackathons, trainings, presentations for our community from internal and external speakers. We also help guide our technologists with persistent releases of code upstream, whether that means helping folks get comfortable with the open source community, or if they want to spin up a brand new standalone open source project, or contributing to existing open source projects that are in line with our business strategy. We wear a lot of different hats in the OSPO at Comcast as they relate to open source, of course. One of the big roles that we play are creating and maintaining an open source culture inside our organization. Our team spends a lot of time making sure projects that we release, which we think are tier 1 projects, like we think they'll be very popular and used across the community, are working well and that they have healthy communities. We help market them, we help promote them, and we try to keep the communities engaged. We also serve as the first go-to group for any questions related to open source licensing, how to contribute back to open source, and any other inquiries as they relate to open source from our community.
Awesome. That's a great deep dive description there. And I know, Nigel, as we introduced you, you helped get the OSPO going at Disney. And probably in your time there, you then saw all sorts of peer organizations getting OSPOs going at the same time. Why do you think we've seen a growth in OSPOs over these last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what we've been seeing over the past few years is really a blurring of the boundaries between proprietary and internal software and external and open software, right? I think we're seeing this emergence of the community of developers who build software not necessarily being contained by the walls of your organization, right? If you look at a typical application, and we've analyzed applications at Disney, typically 80% plus of that code came from outside the company, right? It came from open source developers who are creating libraries and reusable components that are getting used in applications that the company is building proprietary capabilities around. And so, I like to say to people at Disney, hey, 80% of the developers don't work for you, right? They're outside. And so if you sort of take this sort of worldview of software and think about the fact that applications are built from a collaboration of developers who work for companies, your company, work for other companies, they're just motivated to contribute to open source projects, you sort of have to start thinking about how you manage that larger engineering team, right? The developers are not all within your four walls, they're everywhere. And there isn't the ability to freely exchange code with those external developers. Some of it's proprietary, you want to keep it safe. But other parts of the code you do want to contribute. And so I think open source program offices sort of evolved to facilitate that engagement with the outside world, right? I think of open source program offices fulfilling an enablement function, right? And we wrote a policy at Disney, an open source software policy, which sounds like a really scary thing to create because policies usually, there to slap people's wrists about doing bad things. The policy we wrote for Disney was deliberately focused on enabling developers to do things, right? So we're going to enable you to do this stuff, but we're going to educate you so you can take on some of the, the understanding of the risk involved in doing that. And the open source program office is going to be there to help you engage with the outside world, contributing back to the community, working with people outside of the company, but also managing risk for the company. You can't have a sort of throttling function that's sort of constraining every single commit people are making to a source code repository. That's not going to work. It doesn't scale, particularly in a company the size of Comcast or Disney. So I think companies are recognizing that they are part of a larger community of software, and they need an open source program office to enable that to work well. You still have to manage risk. This isn't a free-for-all, but you also have to recognize that open source is an enabling technology, and it can be made better by companies engaging with the outside world, as most companies do these days, right? It's rare to find a company that's basically said, we're not going to engage with the outside world with open source software. It's a failing proposition for a business.
Awesome. That's a great point there. And others, as you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to try to incorporate them into the panel here. But I want to double click a little bit. You talked a bit about developer empowerment, and I think there's sort of an underlying tone of culture change that's a part of that. And I know, Shilla, both you and Nigel have seen this in action. Give us examples, talk about what an OSPO has done and how you've seen this happen in your organizations.
Sure, I can take this one. So prior to our open source program office existing, I mentioned, I have been with the company for a long time, and I remember that our engineers had to talk with our legal team and fill out a long form in order to get an open source contribution approved. So this can potentially cause friction between our developers and sort of make it less easy for them to contribute back upstream. I've heard rumors at other open source conferences that some companies had to fax forms to their legal team to get approved for OSS. So this process can obviously take a lot of time and potentially cause a lot of friction. our OSPO, one of the big culture changes that we made, we're trying to make the process dead easy for our technologists to contribute back to open source. And we're always tweaking and looking at new ways to improve this process. Another area where I see a lot of culture change is around inner source. This is when you're taking open source practices and development and applying them inside of your organization, inside of your firewall. So you act as if it's open source, but it's really internal. And this also brings a lot of culture change into the company. When you work at a big company or large enterprise like ours, it's almost a given that you're going to see teams doing duplicated work, or you'll see teams working on similar projects, or teams may even be siloed, and not on purpose, only because they don't really know who to talk to or where to go. So promoting the culture change of opening up repos and practicing collaboration right at the forefront internally has been a big step towards making that big change on the organization. And we're super thrilled about that.
Awesome. And Nigel, it sounds like that speaks to the development empowerment that you referenced as well. I don't know if you want to even come on back to Shilla or even address that.
Yeah, no, I mean, Shilla raised some really good points. And it's kind of interesting that the open source program at Disney actually came out of an inner sourcing initiative, right? We recognized that what worked well in the outside world in the open source community could also work internally. A company of, several 100,000 employees, looks a lot like the open source community. And so let's facilitate the use of open source practices and processes within the company. And so we started out with this developer productivity idea around connecting developers and sharing code. And out of that came this sort of observation that, like, well, that's great, we can collaborate really well internally now, but we're not doing as well with the outside world. Let's fix that problem. So I think that culture change kind of came from a desire to really be more efficient internally, and that kind of set up the theme of developer empowerment in the initiative. I think the other thing that was sort of interesting when I was forming the open source program, I gathered a bunch of people together and talked about contributing code to the outside world. And a patent lawyer came up to me and said, we can't do that, right? Every line of code is sacred. And there's, it's Disney IP, we can't possibly release that. And so part of the culture change that I had to lead Disney through was really educating people about, well, not all code is super sensitive proprietary IP. Some of it is just kind of ordinary boilerplate stuff that, there's no problem. We need to be careful, obviously, about reducing patented algorithms into open source software and negating the value of that patent. But that's why we have a cross-functional group of people involved in the open source program office, and the same is true, I'm sure, at Comcast, which is getting all these diverse opinions. But part of the sort of mission of the open source program office is really about education, right? And I think we sort of undersold that a little bit at the beginning of the OSPO at Disney. Was, well, we're like, well, we'll just build it and people will come. But we actually had to go educate people, and that involved talking to lawyers and patent attorneys and security people and developers and engineering. We went across the whole company, really bringing people up to speed. And that culture change kind of took over a life of its own. In fact, that patent attorney who was, against releasing any line of code became the strongest advocate for the open source program office, right? We didn't dare to do marketing, we just hired him to do it. He was awesome.
That's awesome. And just looking in the chat here, Joshua Miner, who leads the Open Timeline IO project, I think is +1ing your efforts there, Nigel. He's been working a lot to help get some internal processes going there. And I think some of the early work that you've done there has certainly helped that out. And it certainly helps out a lot of developers that they just want to contribute. They have great things that they're wanting to do. They know their organizations are leveraging open source and they want to give back. And it's great to be a part of starting that pieces of that culture change as a part of it, for sure. So I know we talked about OSPOs in the sense of internal facing, but then there's also the concept of opening up development and opening up things that are happening internally. And that is often just a whole nother bridge to tackle there. I'm sure you both have had some great experiences in this. Tell us a little bit about what's that like and how the role of an OSPO can come in there to really help.
Sure. So I guess I'll kind of touch back on the developer empowerment. One of the things, and I'm not even quite sure if all OSPOs do this. I've talked to a few folks where they do, but one of the ways where we're looking to enable and empower our developers, again, is encouraging them to write blogs or on our internal open source website, or get an article out on opensource.com. A lot of times our processes and our technologies haven't really been shared across the community. And so we work closely with our corporate development team, in addition to the legal team for, open sourcing stuff. We also work with our corporate development team to try to persuade and help get our story out there. And of course, with all the approvals. We also do interview a technologist series to help get their name out in the community. But one of the things we do externally, since you mentioned public and transparent and open source, is we also help them sometimes even put in abstracts for conferences. So if people don't have a particular open source contributions, but they're a huge consumer of open source, we also encourage them to share that story out with the community, whether it's out at a conference or on opensource.com blog, or any other medium.com or other blogs.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the working with the outside world kind of element of this. We have in the OSPO at Disney, we have a release process for releasing Disney developed IP as open source projects, and so teams usually come to us with a request, and that's usually associated with a source code repository they want us to vet for approval. I think Rob sort of talked about how writing open source software kind of raises the bar in terms of quality, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. The term "good enough" for GitHub kind of applies in this case. But we had this project come to us, and they said, "Hey, we want to release this as open source," and we said, "Great, where's the source code?" And they're like, "Well, we haven't written it yet." And we're like, "Well, we need the source code. We can't approve release of the project until you've given us some source code to look at." And they said, "Well, we'll come back to you in a year with the source code." And we're like, "Well, wait a minute. Why don't you build it in the open, right? Why don't you actually, since you're going to release it anyway, why not start open and work with the community to build it, especially since you're looking to drive an open standard? Have the community engage with you from the very start, rather than creating this really shiny object internally and then releasing it fully formed into the outside world." And we ran into this problem at Sun, actually. We were releasing a 3D virtual world as open source, and we made this announcement to the open source community that we'd release version 1.5 in October. And October rolled around, and nothing happened between that announcement and October, right? Nobody engaged at all. They were waiting for this fully formed object to get released. And so when we released it, everybody was disappointed because we hadn't delivered all the things we said we were going to deliver. And so we kind of realized that open source, engaging with the open source community works a different way than enterprise software. And so we had those little mindset shift that had to happen. And so I think part of the role of the OSPO is to kind of educate developers that it's okay to work in the open, right? You actually can work with the community, especially if you're looking to shift away from proprietary technologies to more open ones, and you're trying to establish an open standard and open implementation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a great conversation that's happening in the chat as we speak here. Rob, completely, I think everybody was +1ing of working upstream is just a huge time saver for communities. And I think that's always one of the big selling points of getting involved upstream, is not having to manually integrate your changes, and not just letting other people take advantage of them, but just saving your own time internally. Mm-hmm. And there's a great also discussion there, and some of the work that Larry Gritz has done around open shading language, of just starting out in the open and getting everyone involved sort of that way. So already being an internal focus is saying, hey, we're not starting any of this internally and then doing a big code dump. We're starting, commit one out in the open and beginning. And I think that's a really fascinating, way to approach it. We certainly want to get feedback from the audience. This is a very open session, so people can take themselves off mute, and maybe I'll just give a quick moment here. I have more questions, but I want to have audience questions more than anything. Somebody wants to take themselves on mute and ask a question of one of our panelists. Give a few moments if you want to.
In large companies, I'm curious if you guys, because you both have experience in such big companies, if you have any ideas for further streamlining that office. And you talked about not becoming the bottleneck, which is always tricky. When you think about it from a perspective, even inside of Disney, where you've got all these different divisions and normally a lot of layers of management and maybe some intercompany layers between the office that is strategizing this and the people that are doing the work in the various departments of the various businesses. Do you have any good suggestions, or have you seen models that make it feel more streamlined or speed up the process, especially in large companies?
Oh, you bet. And we made a mistake at Disney in the way that we established the open source program office. We thought, well, it'd be great, we can centralize this function, right? And there'll be one instance of the open source program office. You won't have 27 of them across the company. And that's great. We can have, consistent reviews and all that kind of stuff. All these benefits have come out of it. And of course, it became a bottleneck, right? And so we found that a lot of the business units were saying, we see your open source program office, we're going to do our own. And that was kind of the opposite we wanted to achieve. We wanted to establish standards around open source. And so, the change that we were looking to make with that, and I think it's ongoing at Disney, is really federating out the responsibility for open source approval, granting the business units the ownership of those reviews and approvals, so they can actually can scale much better. One of the things we discovered was that, and this was true of a lot of technology that came out of Pixar and ILM and Lucasfilm, was that the people who were looking to release software or contribute were working in areas that was quite esoteric, and the open source program office had no clue what this technology was, right? Because they were just formed from people from corporate and other business units that weren't involved in movie visual effects, and so it made more sense to have the people in those organizations run the reviews for the people in their organizations, right? And so I think we had to figure out a way of making sure that the standards were being complied with across the organization without being Big Brother and auditing people, right? So I think there's sort of this notion of federating and educating people and allowing them to take on responsibility for their own reviews works well. The other thing we discovered was that a lot of the developers who were coming to us were actually more knowledgeable than the open source program office members in open source. And so we're like, well, why are you coming to us for review? What can't we make you a certified open source developer and give you that responsibility? So I think that goes back to the education component again.
Yeah, and from the Comcast side, I think the ambassador program was really helpful for us. We started by, because we're a small team and we have all these technologists, we decided to find one ambassador from each location and then have them represent the OSPO. And we give them quarterly news and we keep them updated on what's going on. One of the things, so we haven't run into the obstacle where folks want to spin up their own OSPO in other areas, but the ambassadors have been huge. We also, one of the other ways we streamlined our process and we're continuing to tweak is that we have online reviews for upstream contributions like documentation or minor features and bug fixes. And these contribution requests actually get reviewed pretty much that day and they get approved really fast. So that's been awesome. Usually it takes a little bit longer if you have a brand new project that wants to get released or if you have very large features. And those can take, typically around 2 weeks, just depending on the scope of the contribution. But the online reviews and, getting the reviews in faster has been really helpful for us.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Any other questions from the audience here? We have a couple minutes left, and I know this is a new topic, a new concept for many of you, so I want to let you kind of hit the experts here.
I have a question about licenses, and there's sort of maybe some uncertainty or doubt around some of the like GPL license or whether corporations can like contribute or even use some things with the viral licenses. Do you guys have sort of guidance or sort of thoughts on telling people like, well, is there a rule of thumb of like when is that appropriate to use and when is it not?
Absolutely. I'll jump in, and then Nigel, I'll let you take the rest. We actually have a couple folks on our team who focus on licensing and compliance, and they work very closely with our legal team to put together different processes and FAQs in place for what licenses should be used. And we make sure to share that with our community and keep them updated.
Yeah, and at Disney, we essentially classified open source licenses as, pre-approved, no approval needed, go ahead, as long as it hasn't been hacked. Licenses that were kind of dubious and required context in order to get approval, and the GPL ones typically fell into that category. And then there were radioactive licenses that, we'd never touch because of the impact on leaking of IP from within the company as a result of using software with those licenses. So we did that. We also established guidelines on each open source license in our GitHub repository. So developers can go directly there and see what they have to do for any given license, because attribution requirements, for example, vary across open source licenses. We want to make sure the developers are enabled. So we put the information right in their hands. But I think, part of my mission at Disney is to eliminate the open source program office. A little bit controversial, but I essentially want to get rid of all the people, right? And the more that I can automate with tools and pre-approvals, the better, because it's the esoteric questions the open source program office really adds value, and those questions require people with experience and a representation from across the company. So it's like automate the drudgery, streamline that and make things more efficient, but make sure that we are catching the kind of gray areas where there's complexity that needs exploring.
Cool. As someone in the Disney organization, I would love to see that list. We're confused about it and have not seen that guidance. So yeah, I think if that guidance is meant exactly for folks like this, some kind of barriers there that we should cut down. So I will be sending you an email.
Happy to help you with that.
And all the presenters' contact information is right on this slide here. So definitely feel free to reach out to them. We are just hitting time here, and I want to be cognizant of our next presenter here. I want to thank both Shilla and Nigel for being on this panel today. I'm thinking we could have went probably another half hour here. And I'm sure both of them would be thrilled to take any more of your questions that you might have. All of their contact information is here on the screen. Thank you both for doing this panel.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you. This was awesome. Had a great time.
Awesome.